In this episode, we're going to pull together the major ideas you have built so far and reinforce them in a way that feels like a coherent mental model rather than a pile of separate topics. The cloud landscape, instance metadata, and IAM are not three independent chapters that live on different islands. They are parts of the same security story, and the exam will often test you by combining them inside a single scenario. A typical question might describe a cloud workload that was compromised, mention a permission model that seems convenient, and include a small detail about how the workload retrieves credentials, and your job is to recognize how those details connect. Review and recall here means strengthening your ability to see the chain from environment design to attacker opportunity to permission-driven impact. When you can do that calmly, you stop treating questions as surprises and start treating them as puzzles with familiar pieces. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The cloud landscape portion of your mental model starts with remembering why cloud risk often looks different from traditional environments, even though many underlying security principles remain the same. Public cloud is built on shared infrastructure with customer-controlled configuration, which means misconfiguration and over-permissioning become dominant risk drivers. Cloud environments also change quickly through automation, which can replicate both safe patterns and unsafe mistakes at scale. Identity often becomes the steering wheel for most actions because cloud control planes are API-driven, and that makes credential theft and permission design central concerns. Data exposure remains the core impact risk because storage and services are reachable through access policies rather than physical barriers. Monitoring and governance determine whether you can detect and contain misuse, and weak visibility turns small compromises into long dwell time. This landscape view is vendor-neutral because it focuses on how the cloud model behaves, not on which provider name appears in the question. A helpful way to recall the landscape risks is to think in categories that can be recognized quickly in any scenario. Identity risk asks whether valid access can be abused, especially when roles are broad or credentials leak. Exposure risk asks whether resources are reachable publicly or broadly within an environment, including storage, endpoints, and administrative interfaces. Misconfiguration risk asks whether the environment's actual settings match what the team believes, and whether drift is likely. Automation and pipeline risk asks whether the mechanisms that build and deploy systems could leak secrets or replicate bad policies. Supply chain risk asks whether images, dependencies, or integrations could introduce unsafe behavior. Visibility and governance risk asks whether anyone would notice unusual activity and whether boundaries are enforced consistently. When you can name these categories and connect them, you can map where an incident is likely to start and how it could spread. Now tie that landscape thinking directly to metadata, because metadata is often the bridge between a local compromise and broader cloud impact. Instance metadata exists to help workloads discover information about themselves and, in many designs, to obtain temporary tokens that allow the workload identity to call cloud APIs. That convenience is real, but it means that the workload's internal trust boundary becomes crucial. If an attacker can run code on a workload or coerce the workload into making internal requests, the attacker may be able to reach metadata and harvest tokens. Once tokens are obtained, the attacker can act in the control plane as the workload identity, which is often far more powerful than the local system itself. This is why metadata is loved by attackers. It offers speed, leverage, and a path that uses legitimate interfaces rather than noisy exploitation. The exam often frames this subtly, so your recall should focus on the chain, not just the term metadata. Metadata hardening and metadata-safe patterns are the defensive side of that chain, and recall means you should be able to evaluate them quickly. First, ask whether metadata is reachable from the untrusted parts of the workload, especially public-facing application components. Second, ask whether metadata requests require stronger characteristics that reduce request forgery success, rather than allowing basic requests to succeed. Third, ask what metadata can return, especially whether it can provide credentials or tokens, and whether that exposure is limited. Fourth, pair this with the permission scope of the workload identity, because the power of a stolen token depends on what it can do. Fifth, ask whether unusual metadata access or unusual token usage would be visible through monitoring. When these layers are strong, metadata is still useful, but not a shortcut to privilege escalation. When these layers are weak, a single application flaw can become cloud-wide impact quickly. Now bring IAM back into the picture, because IAM is what determines whether the metadata path is a minor issue or a major breach. IAM fundamentals are about deciding who can do what to which resources, and least privilege is the practice of keeping those permissions aligned with real need. Least privilege is a living system because cloud environments change, and permissions that made sense during early development can become dangerously excessive later if not reviewed. Privilege creep is the gradual accumulation of permissions, often caused by convenience roles that get expanded repeatedly instead of redesigned. Auditing IAM policies is how you spot overreach, wildcard abuse, and accidental admin, especially when policies include broad patterns or when permissions combine to create escalation paths. Role separation is how you keep roles from becoming catch-all tools, and how you keep high-risk permissions isolated to small, controlled lanes. These ideas are not abstract because they directly determine how far an attacker can go after stealing any token, including a metadata-derived one. A strong recall point is how accidental admin can appear without any single obvious administrator permission. If an identity can modify access control, attach policies, create roles, assign roles, or assume higher roles, then it may be able to create its own escalation path. Similarly, if an identity can access privileged secrets, pipeline configurations, or systems that can execute code under higher privilege, it may indirectly become an administrator. This is why auditing focuses on what permissions enable, not just what they do directly. It is also why role separation isolates access management capabilities from common roles and prevents workloads from changing their own authority. When you see the phrase accidental admin in your mind, you should also see the idea of escalation doors that can be opened using legitimate mechanisms. That is the essence of cloud privilege escalation, and it is central to exam reasoning. Identity boundaries across accounts, subscriptions, and projects are another point where these topics connect tightly. Boundaries are intended to reduce blast radius, but they fail when identities are shared broadly, trust relationships are too permissive, or high-level role assignments inherit into many environments. A compromised identity in one environment becomes far more dangerous if it can cross into other environments through role assumption or global administrative scope. Conditional access can reinforce boundaries by restricting when and where privileged access is allowed, but it does not replace least privilege and segmentation. A boundary that exists only in billing is not a security boundary unless identity and authorization are scoped to it. Recall here means you should be able to judge whether a scenario's boundaries are real by asking who can administer what across containers and how cross-boundary roles are constrained. When boundaries are validated and enforced, an attacker's token reaches a dead end sooner, which is exactly what you want. Conditional access ties into this model as a context layer that reduces the chance that stolen credentials can be used easily. It adds conditions like device posture, location, and risk signals to access decisions, and it can require stronger verification for privileged roles and sensitive environments. The main recall point is that conditional access is most effective when it is risk-aligned and applied where blast radius is highest. If conditional access is applied evenly everywhere, it can create usability pain without focusing protection on the most dangerous pathways. If conditional access is used to guard overly broad roles, it can help, but it still leaves high impact if the control fails or is bypassed. The better approach is conditional access plus scoped roles plus strong boundaries, so you reduce both the probability of misuse and the impact of misuse. In exam thinking, a secure design is usually one that layers these controls instead of betting everything on a single gate. Reducing permission blast radius is where all of these themes converge into a single outcome you can evaluate. If an attacker compromises a workload and steals a metadata token, the blast radius is defined by the workload identity scope and by what boundaries that identity can cross. If the identity is narrowly scoped to a small resource segment, then the attacker's impact is contained. If the identity can list resources across the organization, modify access policies, or assume roles broadly, the blast radius expands quickly. Scoped roles shrink capability by limiting actions and resources, while segmentation creates the boundaries that make those scopes meaningful. Role separation prevents privilege creep, and auditing ensures that wildcards and accidental admin do not quietly defeat your design. Conditional access reduces the chance that certain identity actions can be performed from risky contexts, and identity boundaries prevent one compromise from becoming many. When you can see blast radius as the output of these design decisions, you can reason about security outcomes more clearly than by memorizing individual features. A practical recall skill is to walk through an attacker chain and identify where it can be broken, because many exam questions are essentially asking where the best breakpoint is. The chain might begin with a workload flaw or a leaked credential from a pipeline, which leads to access inside a workload. From there, the attacker may harvest metadata tokens or retrieve secrets, then call cloud APIs to discover resources and permissions. Next, the attacker tries to escalate by assuming roles, modifying policies, or using overly broad permissions, then moves laterally to other workloads or data stores. Finally, the attacker exfiltrates data or disrupts operations, often using legitimate access paths. Your breakpoints include preventing the initial compromise, blocking metadata harvesting, narrowing the workload identity, restricting role assumption, segmenting resources, enforcing conditional access for privileged actions, and monitoring for unusual identity behavior. The best breakpoint depends on the scenario, but the COM method is always the same. Find the highest leverage control that reduces both likelihood and impact. Another recall point is how shared responsibility gaps amplify these chains, because many failures happen when teams assume the provider is managing something that is actually the customer's job. Providers operate the underlying infrastructure, but customers configure identities, permissions, data access, and many service settings. Metadata risk and IAM risk largely live on the customer side, because they involve how workloads are configured and what permissions are granted. If a scenario includes language that suggests the team assumed the cloud was secure by default, you should suspect missing guardrails, missing logging, and overly broad roles. If a scenario includes rapid adoption and multiple teams, you should suspect configuration drift and privilege creep. Shared responsibility gaps are often quiet because systems still work, and that is why recall matters. You want to notice the gap even when nothing appears broken. Exam questions often reward exactly that kind of attention. As we close, the most valuable thing you can carry forward is a single integrated mental model where cloud landscape risk explains where attacks begin, metadata explains how a local compromise becomes cloud access, and IAM explains how far that access can go. Cloud risk is shaped by configuration, rapid change, and identity-driven control planes, which is why misconfiguration and credential misuse are so common. Metadata becomes a leverage point when workloads can retrieve tokens and attackers can reach metadata through compromise or coerced requests. IAM then determines the outcome by defining scope, boundaries, and escalation paths, and it stays healthy only when least privilege is treated as a living system through auditing and role separation. Conditional access and identity boundaries add context and containment, while scoped roles and segmentation shrink blast radius so incidents do not spread. When you can recall these connections smoothly and apply them to a scenario, you are not just remembering topics, you are thinking like a cloud defender, which is the core skill the exam is trying to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.